All right. Thank you very much for joining this IELTS class. In this class, I'm going to tell you about what happens in IELTS speaking exam, what are you supposed to do, and what you can do basically to maximize your score. So the plan is I will start with some basic information regarding IELTS speaking, specifically IELTS speaking part 1. And then I will go to marking criteria, how they evaluate, how they assess your speech, and based on what criteria they basically give you your score in IELTS speaking from a band score 9, which is the highest, which is the total. And then I will move on to part 1 of the IELTS speaking exam, and I will try to give you some sample questions. I will also talk about timing, how long or how short you should give answers to the questions the examiner asks you, and what strategy you can use in order to get a better score in the IELTS speaking, especially for part 1. And then I will just try to give you some pieces of advice on an overall understanding of IELTS speaking part 1. So as I said, I will start with the basic information. IELTS speaking has got basically 3 parts. Well, they call it parts. Part 1, introduction. Part 2, the cue card. And part 3, the discussion. Well, knowing the name of each separate part, as to my opinion, is not really important. But what is important is that you should know what happens in each part and basically what they want from you in order to maximize your score and to get a higher mark. So it's very, very important to know how you need to approach each part to get a better mark in IELTS speaking parts, different parts. Part 1 basically will take around 4 to 5 minutes. Part 2 will take 3 to 4 minutes. And part 3 will take around, again, 4 to 5 minutes. So in total, IELTS speaking will take around 11 to 14 minutes. Yes, that's it, 11 to 14 minutes. So is it possible that it goes less than 11 minutes? No, it's not possible. Or is it possible that it goes more than 14 minutes? Then again, it's not really possible because IELTS speaking examiners, they have a stopwatch, they have a clock, and they are timing you in each part. And each part, for example, I just told you that part 1, which will take 4 to 5 minutes. So in part 1, which is 4 to 5 minutes, it will be definitely 4 to 5 minutes within this range. So when the 4 to 5 minutes is finished, they will move on to part 2, and they will go to the next part and start with the next part. Let's now see what is the marking criteria and how they evaluate or assess your speech. For IELTS speaking, you should know that there are 4 criteria based on which they will evaluate your speech. The first thing is fluency and cohesion. Number 2, lexical resource. Number 3, grammatical range and accuracy. And number 4 is the pronunciation. And there is no priority in terms of the importance. It's not like number 1 is more important than number 2, or number 2 is more important than number 3 or number 4. No, those are just the 4 criteria, and they are equally important. Each of these criterion has got 1/4 of the total marking in IELTS speaking, which means 25% of your marking in IELTS speaking comes from fluency and cohesion, 25% is lexical resources, 25% grammatical range and accuracy, and again 25% is the mark dedicated to your pronunciation. Let's talk about fluency and cohesion. Fluency is basically, to put it simple, is to keep talking. When they ask you a question, You are not supposed to make a lot of pauses and think about the questions before you can give an answer. So when, for example, in IELTS speaking part 1, for example, when the examiner says, what is your favorite color? What is your favorite color? You're not supposed to spend 5 seconds or 10 seconds to think about an answer for that, because fluency is very important. So when the examiner says, what is your favorite color? You can answer right away. You can say, for example, my favorite color is blue because that is a color of a nice sky on a sunny day in my hometown. Just that. That is a perfect kind of answer. So fluency is important. Don't make long pauses before you can answer. Fluency and cohesion. The other thing in the first criterion, which is important, is the cohesion. Cohesion means the answer you give to a question must be reasonably understandable. You should understand the question first and give an appropriate answer to that question. Make sure you understand the question and then and then give the answer to the examiner. If the examiner asks you a question in any parts of the IELTS speaking and you are not sure what the examiner just asked, maybe because of the accent of the examiner, or maybe there is some big word and there is some vocabulary that you don't understand, you can ask the examiner to repeat the question. For example, if you have accent issues with the examiner is using some very rich British accent, for example, and you don't understand the question, you can ask the examiner to repeat the question politely. Like, for example, can you please repeat the question? I'm not sure what the question is. Could you please repeat that? I beg your pardon. Can you please repeat the question? Try to be polite and ask the examiner to repeat politely. Number 2, lexical resources. Lexical resources is basically a vocabulary, words. Try to use good words and vocabulary. What is, in IELTS speaking, I have heard that many often people say that you must use academic words. Well, I would say yes, that is correct, and no, that is not correct. When it comes to lexical resource or the vocabulary that you use in your IELTS speaking, you should try to use less common words. That is true. Less common words. Words that usually people do not use on an everyday basis. But still you need to try to keep it very natural. If the kind of language or vocabulary that you use in your IELTS speaking is very unnatural and it looks like it's coming from a robot and you are giving the examiner some memorized answers, they will definitely give you no score for that and you will not be evaluated based on that, because that is not your language. That is not the type of language that people use in their conversations. Grammatical range and accuracy, number 3, it means you should try to have a range of grammatical structures, a range of grammar. Try to use, for example, perfect tenses, present perfect, past perfect, future perfect. Try to use conditional sentences. If you can, zero conditional, type 1, type 2, type 3, maybe even mixed conditionals. And on the other hand, there are things like, for example, cleft structure, pseudo-cleft structures. Try to use those structures, which we will practice during IELTS lessons. So those can help you gain a higher score in your IELTS speaking. And based on the marking criteria, if you want a higher score, then you should use grammatical range and accuracy, range of grammar. And later on, when we move on to the lesson, you will see that, for example, if you want to get a band score 7 and plus in speaking, then you need to use, for example, some idioms or phrasal verbs in your speaking, or even collocations. So those are the things that we will focus on during the lesson. Number 4 thing, which is important, is the pronunciation. Pronunciation is very much different from the accent. Accent has 0 mark in IELTS speaking. It means if you speak IELTS, if you speak English with American accent or Indian accent or Arab accent or some Persian accent or Chinese accent or Korean accent, there is no difference in terms of marking. The only thing which is important is the pronunciation. It means when you pronounce a word, it should be easily and clearly understandable. If it is easily and clearly understandable, you will be given a good mark or a full mark, depending on how you pronounce for your pronunciation part. Now, let's move on to part 1 of the IELTS speaking, which is called the introduction part, and see what happens in part 1 of the IELTS speaking. So, as I told you, part 1 will take between 4 to 5 minutes. And the speaking examiner starts with very, very general questions. Obviously, they start with, what is your name? Where are you from? They check your ID or they check your passport to make sure you are the one supposed to be sitting there. And then they start with very general and simple, easy questions. What is your name? Where are you from? What is your favorite color? What is your favorite food? What is your hobby? Who is your favorite singer? What is your favorite sport? What kind of music do you like? As you can see, the questions in part 1, as I said, are very simple, general. Sometimes they even get very, very childish. Like, for example, do you like color red? Why? Why do you like red? Or why don't you like red? For example, do you like to wear sunglasses? Where can you buy sunglasses in your town, in your city, in your country? Things like that. And yeah, I would confess that sometimes even the questions in part 1 get a little stupid or childish, as I said, but this is what this is, and this is how they do IELTS speaking part 1. So again, just to remind you, questions are very simple. So you don't need to be worried about your answers. You don't need to think, and you don't need to make long pauses before you can answer the questions. Let's continue for IELTS speaking part 1. After the general questions, which I just showed you and talked about, they will ask you about 2 more topics. For example, as I showed you here, when they finished general questions, they will say, all right, let's talk about music. This is topic number 1. So they'll ask you around 4 to 6 more questions on music. Then when you finished, for example, answering questions about music questions, the examiner may say, all right, let's talk about education. Then the examiner asks you a few more questions about education. Did you go to university? What did you study there? Do you like your field of study? Why do you like your field of study? Do you think you can get a good job with this education? And questions like that. So again, in part 1, they start with very general questions, and then they ask you 2 more topics. Then part 1 is finished, which will take, as I said, 4 to 5 minutes. What is very important in IELTS speaking part 1 is that it is very important to focus on your fluency. Again, this is very, very important. Of course, grammar is important. Range of vocabulary, lexical resources, pronunciation, all are important. But this is just part 1. This is the introduction. This is a warm-up. and you cannot be given a high score in your IELTS speaking just based on IELTS speaking part 1. So the best thing is that for your part 1, try to focus on your fluency. When they ask you a question, give them the answer right away and don't spend a lot of time thinking about your answers. Let's now move on to some pieces of advice. I usually, when it comes to IELTS speaking part 1, I always tell students, part 1, they will ask you simple questions. Keep it simple. Give them simple answers. Do not try to look for big vocabulary, big grammar, big structure, to give them some complex structure. It is going to be useless. Questions are very simple. Give them simple answers. Another question that I get often is that students say, when they ask me a question, how long do I need to talk? Shall I give them long answers, short answers? Shall I speak for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, or what? So here's my advice. Not too short, not too long answers. For each question they ask you, provide enough information. What I mean by enough is 3 to 7 sentences is enough. Just remember, I'm now talking about IELTS speaking part 1. When they ask you a question, try to answer in 3 to 7 sentences. That is enough. 3 to 7 sentences means around 20 seconds, maybe 25 seconds, a little more or less around that. Do not try to give very long answers like 10 sentences because it will not help you. And the second reason is that the examiner will not let you speak more than that. They will stop you and they will ask you other questions for the part 1. So keep it simple. 3 to 7 sentences would suffice. Next is the part 2 of the IELTS speaking test. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about what happens in IELTS speaking part 2. I will share with you a cue card, a sample question, and I will explain in details what happens in IELTS speaking part 2. But just for now, as an introduction to part 2, I will just keep it very short. In IELTS part 2, which is called the cue card, the examiner will give you a cue card or a task card, something like this, on a piece of paper, plus an extra sheet of paper, plus a pen or pencil. So when you go to the IELTS speaking for part 2, the examiner will give you something like this, plus an extra sheet of paper and a pencil or pen to take some notes. So when they give you this one, they will also give you paper, pencil, and 1 minute, just 1 minute, to prepare your answers to the questions here. So on the cue card or the task card, there are always 4 questions. There is always a topic with 4 questions. The topic basically always starts with describe a person, a place, an event, your likes, your dislikes, and then 3 here, and then 1 question here. So generally there is a topic and 4 usually WH questions, but you can get WH questions like who, what, where, when, which, why, plus maybe they might ask you to ask a question starting with how. So always and always and always, this is the format, this is the structure, what happens in IELTS speaking part 2. So they'll give you this, a topic and 4 questions, and then you'll have only 1 minute to make some notes, prepare your speech, and then talk about the topic, answering the questions in 1 to 2 minutes. So again, they will give you 1 minute first to prepare your answers. After the 1 minute is finished, the examiner says, all right, please start. Then when you start speaking, you must talk about this topic, answer the questions in 1 to 2 minutes, minimum 1 minute, maximum 2 minutes. If you want to speak for more than 2 minutes, the examiner will not allow you. They will stop you. They will ask you some questions. Then they will go to part 3. Make sure this is 1 to 2 minutes. Make sure your speech does not go less than or below 1 minute, because you will lose a lot of mark. Minimum 1 minute, maximum 2 minutes. And then I always suggest students to speak around 1 minute and 45 seconds. 1 minute 40, 1 minute 45, 1 minute 50. Try to get as close as you can to the 2 minutes in order to get a higher score. Well, still, we will need to talk more on part 2 and the next lessons. I will talk more in details about what happens in IELTS speaking part 2 and what you can do, what is the strategy, how long or short you should give answers to the 4 questions on the cue card in order to get a higher mark in your IELTS speaking part 2. But for now, I think that is enough for the lesson today. Thank you very much for joining the lesson. I hope you enjoyed this lesson, and I hope you have learned something from this lesson. All right. Thank you very much for now. I'll see you soon. Bye.